With the advent of social media and Formula 1 getting on the social media gravy train now Bernie's not around, it's never been easier to keep up with your favourite form of motorsport. Well, I mean, if you can get hold of F1 TV in your country and you're able to pay for Sky Sports, it's never been easier. The sport behind a paywall aside, it wasn't that way for a very long time. Purely because when Formula 1 first hit our screens, there weren't that many channels. And when I was a kid in the UK in the 90s, we only had 4 channels. It became 5 when Channel 5 launched, and even then, it was pretty difficult to get hold of Channel 5 in the early years of its broadcasting career. But we might touch on that a bit later, depending on how things go. Satellite TV was a thing in the 90s, and that gave you a lot of extra channels. But as far as what we called normal telly back then, you only had 4. But if you can't afford or don't want to pay for Sky or any other forms of paywall sport, there's highlights on YouTube after every race. There's also post-race analysis, the grill the grid stuff, highlight packages of historic races that really kicked off during the pandemic because there was a pretty big gap to fill, and people violating copyright laws by uploading full races themselves. Putting "no copyright infringement intended" in the description doesn't get you off the hook. Oh, and there's things like Motorsport Magazine. They've got a massive archive that you can access for about $5.99 a month, and in the year and a half I've had my subscription, it's paid for itself. So it's never been easier, at least theoretically, but for a long time you had to make do with what you had. And Formula 1's broadcasts have come a very long way since they started in the late 1970s. Because, as mentioned, back in ye olden days, at least in the UK, Formula 1 wasn't something that was on all the time. For one, the calendars were much shorter, so there wasn't a race on seemingly every other week like today, and, as we established a little bit before, there were only 3 channels. Well, I mean, there were only 2 channels, BBC and independent television, better known now as ITV. In 1965, BBC Two was launched, with one of its early channel controllers being none other than Sir David Attenborough. Yes, that David Attenborough, the guy who knocks about with turtles and stuff. BBC One and BBC Two were on channels 1 and 2, which was very easy to remember, and ITV was on channel 3. And it's actually legally known as Channel 3 even today. So there were only 3 channels with very limited programming. Sports would only go on if it was in the public interest, such as the World Cup, the FA Cup and even Division 1 football. Because it might shock some people to learn, football existed before 1992 and the formation of the Premier League. And Formula 1 would occasionally make it onto television. But it would be things like the Race of Champions, the non-championship race from Brands Hatch, and things like the British Grand Prix, Monaco Grand Prix, and maybe the Italian and German Grand Prix. Highlights of other races usually made it onto ITV's World of Sport programme. But things changed in the mid-1970s, all thanks to then Brabham owner Bernie Ecclestone. I've actually done a video on how Bernie took over, calling the video From Brabham to Billions or something along those lines, detailing how he bought the television rights for the sport and then offered the teams 10% in return. When the teams told him no, he kept the money for himself. But with the Concord Agreement and everything else coming in the 80s, the money in the sport went stratospheric. But in 1976, Formula 1 was taken off the air thanks to the Surtees team having sponsorship from the contraceptive company Durex. Cigarettes were apparently fine, but condoms, that's a no-go apparently. And the bosses at the BBC and ITV decided they weren't going to show Formula 1 because of the logos on Surtees' car. Yeah, 1976, the year that James Hunt won the title. Hunt was in the, hunt for the title, but nobody got to see any of it because the old blokes at the top of the BBC and ITV were getting a bit Puritan about things. But because of the 1976 Japanese Grand Prix where James Hunt won the title and captured the British public's imagination, Jonathan Martin went to see his bosses at the BBC and started pitching some ideas. At the end of the meeting, the BBC's Grand Prix programme was born. The first edition of the programme was the 1978 Monaco Grand Prix, which also saw the debut of a certain theme song. The BBC had, for some reason, chosen The Chain by Fleetwood Mac as the theme tune, and the album that song comes from, Rumours, was only released the previous year. The BBC's only coverage of Formula 1 today is on the radio, and they still use The Chain, even now. Auntie showed 11 races that year, but not all of them were live. Most were highlights packages shown later on at night. It wouldn't be until 1979 that the BBC took over full exclusive broadcasting of Formula 1. Prior to this, racing had been broadcast in some format since the first race at Silverstone in 1950, with the first known full broadcast coming from the British Grand Prix of 1953. For a time, only the British and Monaco Grand Prix were aired live, the others given highlights on either the BBC or ITV, and in some cases, races weren't broadcast at all, live or highlights. But with the BBC getting the exclusive rights in 1979, more and more races ended up on television, with the voice of Murray Walker taking you through all the proceedings. And Murray getting the job wasn't because he was so good at what he did, but because the original choice for the hosting job, Raymond Baxter, was committed to a programme called Tomorrow's World. So Murray got the job instead. But for the most part, what you saw is what you got, because, well, the data they could put up on the screen was rather limited. It wouldn't be until the 1980s that things started to resemble a modern sports broadcast, at least what we would consider a modern sports broadcast. Because there was so much going on, it was harder to broadcast things like timing and gaps and everything else compared to, say, a football score, for instance, because football scores are a very static thing, and you only update them when there is a goal. In the late 80s, you started to see more graphics on screen, and this was becoming the case for a lot of sports, with athletics and the Olympics getting in on things as well because electronic timing was now a thing. But the data on the screen was basic at best. It was just whatever font they could get their hands on. It looked like they robbed the font straight out of the Matrix. And this text was just put on the screen. It didn't matter if you could read it or not, it was on the screen and that's what mattered. Not even Tag Heuer or Longines or whoever was doing the timing got any special treatment. They couldn't even put their logo on the broadcast because the technology wasn't there yet. By 1981, more European races were being shown live on the BBC's Sunday Grandstand programme, but this was still dependent on what other sports were happening. Because Grandstand was essentially a round-the-houses show. They would simply hop from sport to sport so they could get everything into the limited time frame they had. So, as an example, they'd have some horse racing from Aintree at 1 o'clock or something, then highlights of the BTCC from Thruxton at 1:15. Then they'd go some athletics in Copenhagen for an hour before some gymnastics in Helsinki that would lead into the halftime football scores, although the football scores were more of a Saturday thing. Then they'd get some rallycross for some filler, back to the athletics, the next race from Aintree, and then some other stuff before the football finished. Some of the so-called flyaway races did make it into a live slot, such as the 1986 finale in Australia where, colossally, that was Mansell. The graphics steadily improved going from the late 80s into the early 90s. They could add a splash of colour so they could separate the driver's name from the team he was driving for, and in a lot of cases add the driver's helmet so you could identify that driver a little bit better. But in 1994, Formula 1 hit the big time with the television graphics. They came up with something that became quite iconic. This. The old-style F1 graphics that began use in 1994. Gone were the basic text, and now there was a way of accurately presenting the data to the viewers at home. By modern standards, it is very basic. You have the driver's name in white, the car number in a cyan oval, the team name also in cyan, and the tyres in use. G for Goodyear, even when Goodyear was the only supplier, and then the position being shown in a big yellow box with a black number. And this was shown on a translucent black background so the data was separate from the TV footage. What you have to remember is that this is analog television. The picture was 240i, if that. 4K didn't exist. HD 1080 certainly didn't, and if you lived in an area with an iffy signal, it was the best way of separating things. The driver battle graphic got a similar treatment. The gradient stuff was just a graphic, even if I was convinced as a 6-year-old it moved as the drivers got closer or further apart, and the gap was shown in the middle. To make things easier to follow, the previous gap would be shown in brackets so you knew how much it had changed by. Simple, effective, and now, iconic. And this was all handled by FOM rather than the individual broadcasters that handled each Grand Prix. You might have heard references in old broadcasts to the local television director who would be more focused on local pay drivers more than any battles happening on track. The last broadcast the BBC did was the 1996 Japanese Grand Prix, because in late 1995 ITV paid massive money to shift the rights over onto their channel. All because, in the words of Murray Walker, ITV was sick of getting destroyed by the BBC on Sundays when races were on. In the initial deal, ITV paid £60 million over 4 years for the TV rights. That's £123 million now. And for the first time in Formula 1 history, we had to deal with adverts because, well, this was ITV. Did anybody else get a sense of dread when they saw the fuzzy box of doom in the top right hand corner, or was it just me? If you live outside the UK and you've seen some of these older race broadcasts on YouTube, this might be something that you see every so often. You might have discovered that there's a pattern that emerges when this box turns up. It's called a Q mark, and it's because ITV, much like the BBC, is split into regions. And unlike the BBC, ITV has ad breaks. And like I mentioned, you might have seen that there's a pattern that develops when this Q mark appears. It appeared anywhere between 90 seconds and 3 minutes before the next ad break. In the 90s, ITV was a conglomerate of several independent franchises, which I think are now all under the same banner. London Weekend Television, or LWT, Anglia, Carlton, Granada, Border, Yorkshire, Tyne Tees, Thames and Central were the main ones, each producing their own programming that went on to the national broadcasts. So, as an example, LWT produced Gladiators and You Bet. Yorkshire Television produced Heartbeat, a show that filled 90s kids with dread because the theme song announced that it was nearly bedtime because you got school in the morning. Central did The Price is Right and Bullseye, and Meridian produced the kids' TV show Zap. British television in the 90s, the absolute best in the world. Quality, not quantity. Each of these franchises was linked to a certain region of the UK, which also helped with things like local news broadcasts, which always followed ITN's main bulletins. Central is the region I'm in, being Birmingham and the Midlands. Then you've got Tyne Tees, which is Newcastle, Sunderland and the North East, Anglia being the East, and so on. It allowed for any local adverts to be inserted into the national broadcast, essentially. I don't really recall, but I don't think these Q marks were used on any regional programming, because the regional programming would have regional adverts. Anybody else remember Calendar? The long and short of it is, this box told you it was time to whack the kettle on. When Bernie Vision, or the F1 digital platform, collapsed in 2002, a lot of what Bernie Vision was doing was ending up into the ITV broadcasts and the other FOM broadcasts that were going out around the world. And to save you the hassle, I've already done a video on Bernie Vision that you can watch at your leisure, but yeah, I'll cut ahead because I've already done that bit. Into the 21st century, the digital age had now begun. And while the classic graphics received a refresh in 2002 to clean them up a bit, television quality had now increased enough that they could now be made less intrusive, and a bit smaller. Because the signal was now cleaner, because the signal is now either off or on, being digital. But the design was largely the same because not many people had digital aerials at this point. Those who were still on analog would still need to be able to read them. But in 2003, that's when the Bernie Vision graphics really made their mark on the ITV broadcasts. The new graphics were a lot more visually striking, despite being monochromatic for the most part. You now had the name of the driver and team stacked closer together, and country flags were also included, with the tyre manufacturers being given red or blue depending on which one was being used. Red for Bridgestone and blue for Michelin. And for graphics showing the gap between two drivers during the Grand Prix, more colour was introduced. Yellow meant that time had been lost, green meant that time had been gained. Much easier to follow. But what wasn't easy to follow was that the lap counter started at the number of laps and then counted back. Because reasons. We're on lap 17, so why does it say 43? Oh, and the standings tower that came in for 2004 started at the bottom and went upwards, although this was reversed for 2005. And what's been known as Digital 2005 has become the basis of what is being used today. As time went on, things like position changes were added, qualifying drop zone colours added from 2006, and later on the lap counter would change colour if yellow flags came out. And eventually it went upwards rather than downwards. And it meant that the lower thirds became less cluttered, as the graphics didn't need to be as big to get the same result. The graphics meant that you could still watch the action, or lack thereof because this was the mid-2000s, and just give a cursory glance at the data. But mostly, this was all an updated version of the Bernie Vision graphics, because rev counters with speed and everything else were added to give viewers an idea of just how fast these machines were going. What's interesting about these graphics is, when Formula 1 started broadcasting in a 16:9 aspect ratio, the graphics didn't move. You would have expected them to move a little bit further over so that it wasn't in the way. But because not everybody had a 16:9 television at this point, with a lot of people still on 4:3, it meant that they could still watch the Grand Prix without all of that data being cut off. But Formula 1 was able to add a lot of stuff in this time frame, stuff that we think of as being, well, standard now. Things like as it stands championship points would come up, and these got a lot of use at the 2007 and 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix. as well as lap-by-lap comparisons that would show how fast a driver was catching to the car ahead or how fast the car was pulling away, however you want to look at it. But Formula 1 would leave ITV at the end of 2008, with the BBC picking the rights back up. Finally, no more adverts getting in the way of well, we didn't miss a lot. Okay, there were some things that ITV missed because they were on an ad break, but it didn't happen that often. Jake Humphrey took over the hosting duties, with Eddie Jordan and others joining in. The only ones to go from ITV to the BBC were Martin Brundle and Ted Kravitz, and FOM decided that making the graphics into parallelograms was a good idea. The parallelograms were okay, but the big change came for 2011, when the parallelograms became HD. Small updates were made over the years before they got another big refresh in 2015. But in the interim was going to be big change, because on the 29th of July 2011, the news came that the BBC would enter into this broadcast sharing deal with Sky. Although Sky would have the rights to every session live on their own dedicated channel, while the BBC would only get selected races, with the rest being highlights. Humphrey would leave at the end of 2012 because his career aspirations pointed towards football more than Formula 1, with Susie Perry taking over. The BBC would keep the free-to-air coverage until 2014, when they lost it to Channel 4. And this was seen as being a big thing at the time, because up until Channel 4 got the Formula 1, their only real sports output had been horse racing, cricket, and Italian football. Gazzetta Football Italia, what a show that was. Oh, and for a brief time in 2000, WWF Wrestling. The 2015-17 graphics are probably my favourite graphics in Formula 1. We've seen so many companies change their identity to these crisp, clean logos, with Jaguar and Korean Air being the worst offenders in recent years. But Formula 1 got these 2015 graphics right. Clean and minimal. And it meant that it was now so much easier to keep up if you were a new viewer, with the coloured stripe acting as a team identifier being a splash of colour on an otherwise monochromatic package. So if you were a Daniel Ricciardo fan, you looked for the purple stripe. You looked for a red one for the Ferraris, and so on. And I have no idea why they ever got rid of it. I think it was also at this time, although it might have been a tiny bit earlier, that we started seeing purple being used for the fastest overall lap. That gave you even more information without filling the screen. You also had a ticker at the bottom that allowed for more of the screen to be filled with racing. But in 2018, those graphics disappeared. Formula 1 now had new owners in Liberty Media, and while they did do what Bernie never wanted to do, and that is jump on the social media stuff, and to be fair, that has worked quite well, they decided to reboot all the graphics and give them new fonts, and add some extra graphics and other bits and pieces. And it all came under criticism at the time. My own personal complaint is that it looked too much like a video game and was largely unnecessary, while others said that the new opaque look to the graphics made things look cluttered, compared to the crisp and clean ones that had been in use between 2015 and 2017. Away from this though, Formula 1 was now going to be off free to air for good. At least for now, although I'm not holding my breath. In 2018, Whisper Films, the production company that runs the production for Channel 4's coverage, had to go the process of renegotiating the deal, and did so, with Channel 4 maintaining a highlights package for every race of the season, with the exception of the British Grand Prix, which is one of our protected sports events, if you want to call it that. Australia has got a similar law, where sporting events of a significant cultural standing must be allowed to be on free-to-air television. These including, but not being limited to, the FA Cup Final, the Euros and the World Cup for football, the Wimbledon Tennis Championships, and the British Grand Prix. Not the Ashes though, weirdly. As part of the new deal, although Whisper decided to do this rather than Formula 1, is that they would present all the flyaway races from a studio in the UK, but go on location to all the European races to save on costs and carbon. A bit like how the old broadcasts were done. Murray saying that he was loving the weather in Monaco, but really he was in a BBC studio in Shepherd's Bush, having just walked there from his house in Fulham. Although in recent years there have been a couple of exceptions to this exclusive live TV stuff, both of them happening in 2021. Channel 4 managed to get the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix because it could have been where Lewis Hamilton won his 8th title, and we'll ignore the rest of what happened that particular day, and they also managed to get the 2021 US Open Women's Final, the latter of which being watched by 9 million people as British tennis player Emma Raducanu won that particular match. They paid 7 figures for that. They got their money back and then some. And in 2024, Whisper had to go through the tender process for the Formula One again, saying this time it had been a lot tougher, and they managed to get the rights until the end of 2026. So hopefully they or somebody else manages to keep it on free to air for a long time, because at least in Britain there is now quite a resentment for sports being put behind very expensive and very exclusive paywalls. And the coverage on Channel 4 has been largely positive, because Channel 4 has got the largest streaming network of the 5 terrestrial channels and has actually increased its sports programming since it took on Formula One. And to think, it all started with Bernie paying $1 million back in 1976. So then, a look at how F1 broadcasts and graphics have evolved over the last 50 years or so, at least on British TV. If this has been an interesting look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help keep the lights on or help with the image purchasing, there'll be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for any one and done donations and memberships so you can Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.